The other thing that I really valued about his seminar and the way he teaches is that he really emphasized that each and every one of us, regardless of our level of Arabic or background in tasawwuf or whatever, have something unique to offer that nobody else does. So it was very encouraging of participation from other people, and was really good at drawing out the insights that each member of the group will have. And he said this kind of reading is really best done in groups. We all come from different places, climates, we have different histories, different things have happened to us, and that determines the shape of our mirror. And that then our mirrors then delimit the tajalliyat, the manifestations of God that can be manifest to us, and that's what creates these delimited, restricted concept notions of God that we have. The best way for me to see the sun is to look in that mirror, if my view of the sun has been blocked. And so he says that's why you have to look to the Prophet. And he says nobody has the capacity, the preparedness of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. And so that's why looking to him and worshiping his Lord, ila rabbika muntaha, right? The reality of the divine transcends any conceptual construction, any discursive description. But it's very, very difficult to actually see that. And in all of these diverse and dizzying forms of belief, to recognize the real in each of them, recognize the aspects of the real that are revealed, recognize the aspects of the real that are concealed in each of these forms of the belief, because all of them delimit the real to a certain fluid state of taqallub, of constant changing of the heart that is like the Quran says, kullu yawmin huwa fi sha'n. Every day he's on a new affair, a new task, the perpetual tajalliyat from the real. And only a heart that's infinitely flexible and receptive can receive all of them and recognize all of them. There's a saying in English, a broken clock is right twice a day. And even if it's stopped, twice a day it's right. So the job of the arif is to recognize what's correct there, what of the real is manifest in there, but then also what is concealed on the real. But Ibn Arabi says it's like a continuous orbit around the real, in which you're continuously seeing new facets, new dimensions of the real. It's constantly changing. That's why he calls it the station of no station. It's not fixed. It's not one particular station, but rather flows through all stations. In fact, Ibn Arabi says, this is the Ahlullah, the property of God flows over them. The property of God is to be non-delimited. And so they're also not, this is one of the things what it means to be made in the image of God. And honestly, if you're studying Irfan and it's not improving you in your day-to-day interactions with, like, let's say your family, which can be the most difficult, or other people, then something's wrong. In fact, Mullah Sadras, as far as a really good source for reconstructions of Greek manuscripts that have been lost later on. So it was like, okay, the skeptics said this and the Stoics said this. One of the reasons why the Ishraqi tradition was used a lot to interpret when people came across Buddhist and various forms of Hindu and other Dharmic traditions, they would use the Ishraqi tradition to try to interpret and understand it as a kind of their theory or their philosophy of religion. You have all kinds of interesting things going on in India when people also then have understandings of Islam that are they understand it through their Dharmic traditions. So they understand the Prophet Muhammad as an avatar and then you even have Hindu pundits who write commentaries on the Fusus as well. So they're still Hindu, they're practicing Hindus, but they study the Fusus because, again, la taqra fi tajalli, right? If he was saying the same thing right here, right now, as Suhrawadi was saying in 12th century Damascus, that wouldn't be fresh. Like Abu Madyan said, give us fresh meat, right? It's something fresh from the real. If it's fresh from the real, it'll appear different. Or as we said before, lawn al-ma, lawn al-ina'i. Color of water is the color of its container. God will judge between you wherein you differ. It is up to us to strive and to compete with one another in good works and good actions, and God will judge when we differ. I don't see anything, I haven't seen any convincing arguments, whether from aql or naql, that the worst Muslim will be better than the best Christian. Like you see in the Olympics, you have these different nations, and they're all competing to do different things, and that's the way I see it. We're trying to compete with one another in our love for and our devotion to God. When you conform to the truth, in your behaviors, in your inward states, in your character, in your ethics. In a certain sense, you become the truth, and you can know the truth directly and intimately. And then that truth will then be reflected on the mental plane. But that kind of serious riyada and self-discipline is much harder, than forming these conceptual maps. Or you have the story of Sayyidina Yusuf in the Quran, Ahsan al-Qasas, which again is not just the story of a particular person in a particular place, but it's the story of humankind, the story of the soul. Or the story of the Bani Israel and Sayyidina Musa being led out of Egypt. It's also the story of the soul leaving the bondage of the ego and wandering through the deserts of Suluk until they reach the promised land. And all this. So this is what's meant by sacred history. Among the greatest poets, there are always Sufi poets. And so in Persian, Hafiz, Rumi, etc. In Arabic, you have Ibn al-Farid. In Turkish, you have Yunus Emre. You have in various Turkic languages, Fuzuli, Ghalib, and others. In Punjabi, Sindhi, Bengali, all of the greatest poets are Sufis. Because these authors had access to the realms of divine beauty, and that beauty conformed themselves to it. That beauty imprinted itself on their souls and was then manifest in their verse. In the numerical symbolism as well too, most of the ceilings you'll notice have some kind of 8 pattern, octagonal or something like that. In the Quran, the arsh is carried by 8 angels. 8 also represents the heart, and so it's the intermediary between the throne, heaven, and then the base, which is usually square, the earth. If you look on the minbars, the geometric patterns, they usually have a 6 on them. 6, or they'll have 14. Either way, it represents the Prophet. Taha, if you add up numerical symbolism, is 14. 14 is also the number of the full moon. It's halfway through. It's through the lunar cycle. It's the number of the luminous letters. Sabon Mathani. So many things with 14. 6 as well too. 6 is the perfect number. 1 + 2 + 3. 6 is the letter Waw in the Abjad system, and Waw is what joins things together. As well, it's also the very last letter in terms of the makharij, the places where the letter comes out. So Waw represents the Prophet Muhammad, who joins things together, and it's the very last thing to come in creation. The very purpose of creation, the last of the prophets, was one in which the cosmos was reflected within the human being, and both the cosmos and the human being reflected the divine names and attributes. So when you have this connected cosmos, it's then reflected in the architecture, it's then reflected in the poetry, it's reflected in the music. There are all of these things. Shakespeare loves doing plays within plays precisely for this reason. So he'll point out to you, in the middle of a play, there'll be a play. And that will point out to you the artifice of the play, which then makes you think about, whoa, my own world is also, but the Qamis Yusuf works in this magical way because it carries the scent of Yusuf, the presence of Yusuf, the presence of the beloved. Instead of veiling sight, it's a veil that reveals rather than conceals. So the arts, we think of visual things as things that are veils to the unseen. It is gracious to us. Then we can go beyond the forms to the real. And then we can come back and recognize the real in all of these different forms. We can recognize all of these different forms as tajalliyat, as manifestations of the real. All of this, you can say this, all of the sounds of great Sufi poetry and music emerge from that divine silence and lead us back to that divine silence, which is our origin and end, and that's ultimately what we're all seeking, and which is present with us all the time. We just have to learn to be present with it.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. نرحب بكم في سلسلة حوارات فكرية ومعرفية على قناة حيرة. In this interview, we're interviewing Dr. Oladamni Organic. Dr. Oladamni is a scholar of African, Islamic, and religious studies. He focuses on Irfani and Sufi studies, artistic dimensions of the West African Sufism, and philosophical dimensions of old religious traditions in West Africa, Sufi poetry, philosophy of religion. He's completing work on 2 books, Deep Knowledge, Ways of Knowing in Sufism and Ifa, 2 West African intellectual traditions. The other book is about poetry in praise of prophetic perfection, West African Madih poetry. Dr. Olademni is a graduate of Harvard College and earned his PhD from Harvard University's Department of African and African American Studies. He is currently an assistant professor in Islamic and African religious studies at the University of Virginia. So welcome, brother. Honor having you with us today.
Thank you so much for having me with you. It's a really wonderful channel, and I'm very honored to be with you here today. Thank you so much for the invitation.
So we have many topics to discuss, from Arfan to Sufism to philosophy of religion, and we'll try to delve into different topics, going through flowers from different gardens of your articles, such as shining of the lights and the veil of the sights and the secrets bright, and annihilation in the messenger in the Irfani school, and the presence of poetry, the poetry of presence, and the myth and the secret destiny. You present Mيرسيا, Iliad's creative hermeneutics. So all these stuff. But in the beginning, tell us more about yourself. So when was your first encounter with Sufi studies, Ibn Arabi studies, religious and philosophical involvement? Why you chose this field as your academic study? So tell us more about your journey in life and the major that you are working in.
Thank you very much. It's a long story, long story, but I'll try to keep it short because I know we have a lot of other things to speak about. I think my first introduction to Sufism, I spent my childhood in Lagos, and the Tijani order is very popular there. So I would hear the wazifas and I would hear the recitations of prayers and poetry, but I was a kid, so I didn't really know what was going on. Then my next introduction, my family is very musical. My mother's a music teacher, and I used to always explore the world music sections. And one of my favorite musicians to listen to and favorite genres of music throughout all of secondary school, high school, was Qawwali. I loved Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan. So I was listening to all of this Sufi poetry without really fully understanding it. But my real introduction to Sufi studies came in my first year in college. He's now a dear friend of mine, but we were roommates at the time. Nicholas Boylston, now professor of Sufi studies as well, was taking some classes on Islamic philosophy. And he said, hey, I think you'd really dig this Ibn Arabi guy. I think you'd really like Ibn Arabi. And he gave me a few books of his, along with books of other philosophers. So I read Ghazali's Munkid min ad-Dalal, Deliverance from Error. At that time, I also was reading Buddhist philosophy at that time as well too. But Ibn Arabi, and at the same time I started reading Attar's Conference of the Birds. It really grabbed my heart, and I was like, wow, this is incredible. It went beyond anything I had kind of read philosophically, intellectually, religiously, and yet combined them all together into this incredible synthesis. So the seeds were sown then, although I was studying neuroscience at the time. I eventually left neuroscience and came to do my graduate work to focus on Sufism in West Africa. So that's my introduction was through books, particularly translations of, my Arabic wasn't very good. I mean, I barely had any. Translations of Ibn Arabi's works in English. John Adakri's translation of the Fusus, I read that cover to cover so many times. William Chittick's Sufi Path of Knowledge. I then also read things like Martin Links's What is Sufism and Sufi Saint of the 20th Century, Said Hossein Nasr's Garden of Truth and Knowledge and the Sacred. I said translations of Attar's poetry, translations of Iraqi's Lama'at. These works were kind of my constant companions. I used to take them with me on the plane when I travel and just read and read and read. And they gripped my soul in a way.
Great. You mentioned Dr. Nicholas Boylston. He's a great researcher on Ain al-Qudha al-Hamadani.
Yes.
And tell us more about your PhD and what was your thesis about, and tell us more about the teachers that you learned from or you benefited from in the States.
Oh man, yeah. That's a lot. So my thesis, one of the books that I carried around and I loved a lot was Izutsu's Sufism and Taoism. I really loved that.
Comparative religion studies, the deep book.
Comparative, yeah, exactly. I loved that book so much, and so I wanted to do my dissertation to be kind of a version of that. That was one of the books that I really appreciated the most, and so I chose to do my dissertation on. Instead of he focused on Ibn Arabi, I focused on Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse, who's the most influential Sufi sheikh on the African continent in the 20th century. And Izutsu focused on ontology. I focused on epistemology, the science of ways of knowing. So Izutsu did Ibn Arabi and Zhuangzi, or kind of the Taoist tradition in general, and I focused on the Tijaniya, particularly Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse. And then Ifa, which is a pre-Islamic religious tradition from my own people, the Yoruba people of Nigeria. So to do this, and I tried to use Ibn Arabi as a kind of theorist to help me understand both traditions. So the Tijani tradition draws heavily on Ibn Arabi's vocabulary, terminology, cosmology, etc., but does its own unique things with it. But more, I thought Ibn Arabi could help me do kind of comparative work in a serious way. And then, yeah, so I learned from Professor Morris, James Morris, as well. He used to run an Ibn Arabi seminar where we'd read the Fusus and then part of the Futuhat every Thursday night in Boston. So myself and several other people who are now also scholars in their own right, Axel Takas and Nicholas Boylston, Nariman Avani, many other people, we all attended that session together. And
tell me more about this session, about its spirituality, about its characteristics, because I've heard from many of the people in Harvard and Boston, they praise this session and Dr. Morris specifically, and regarding his method of teaching and passing on the nur and the knowledge in this session.
Yeah, I mean his method of teaching is I mean you interviewed him, so you know he's a very unique person. He's not a linear talker or a linear thinker. So what he'll do is we'll read, and just like in most graduate seminars, you read the text, you try to translate it. Well, then Professor Morris jumps in and has you think about what about, does this ring true in your own life experiences? What things in your relationships with other people, what things have you experienced in life, even with nature, with animals? What can you bring to the table that will bring this to life? So Ibn Arabi can be talking about something like going into the Ardla Samsama, like the land of the white sesame, the world of imagination. And it's really wild and it seems very, very far away. And little by little, Professor Morris will make it seem very close and not so far away, and make you relate your own experiences to that and make you see things from a very different angle. There's never been a time when we've read and translated the text and then he's finished speaking about it that we then see it in the same way. After he's finished talking, you see it in a completely different way. And this is the amazing thing.
Manifestation, huh?
Yeah, la tejley. There's no repetition in the manifestation. And then if we come back to that passage again, we'll see it in a different way. The other thing that I really valued about his seminar and the way he teaches is that he really emphasized that each and every one of us, regardless of our level of Arabic or background in Tasawwuf or whatever, have something unique to offer that nobody else does. So he was very encouraging of participation from other people and was really good at drawing out the insights that each member of the group will have. And he said this kind of reading is really best done in groups for this reason, to try to bring out the unique insights that...
So he really respects each soul, and which is one of the great lessons of Sufism in general, respecting people deeply.
Exactly. And he really manifests that in his classrooms. And then I've tried to do that, model that in my own teaching as well. I mean, but all of this was not for credit. He wasn't getting paid for this. None of us were getting credit for it, which I think part of why there was so much barakah in it, because it was completely, everyone was just there for the love of truth and knowledge and Ibn Arabi. And so it was a really good session. And then there were others. There's a prominent philosopher in Iran, Ghulam Reza Avani, who came to the States, and I had the opportunity to sit and study Sohrawardi with him and Qaisari's Muqaddimah. So I studied Hikmat al-Ishraq with him and Qaisari's Muqaddimah. And at the end of every lesson, he would read one poem of Hafez and then comment on it for us as well, which was really, really remarkable. So alhamdulillah, I've had, and
So
then
by time you learned Arabic and Persian poetry also.
Yani, my Persian, I haven't kept up with my Persian, so it's a little weaker. But I can still read all right in Persian, alhamdulillah. And I learned it's worth it to learn Persian just to read Hafez. Honestly, it's really incredible. Yeah, so alhamdulillah, I've been blessed to study with a lot of different teachers. And then in the time I spent in West Africa working on my dissertation, I got the chance to interview many great shuyukh and awliya and ask them questions, very personal questions about their life, about ma'rifah, about how they got ma'rifah, about how the different awrads work, about all kinds of different things.
I'll ask you later about one of or two of your very important memories with this shuyukh, if you'd like to share, or if you'd like to share now also.
Oh my goodness. I mean, to be honest, there are some, I don't know if you've experienced this where you go to some maqams, but you go there and your mind just becomes blank. You've no more thoughts, no more worries, no more troubles. You're just happy. You just feel the peace, that sakina. So I felt that very much in the presence of many of these many of these shuyukh. And there are all kinds of other interesting karamat that people have attributed to them. But one of the greatest for me was just seeing the way in which they treated everyone equitably. Some researcher coming to them from the US, some poor person coming to them, some big scholar or president coming to see them, some rich Khaliji coming to them for some. They treated everyone equitably, and that really was one of the most incredible things I'd ever seen. And the way they never spoke ill of anyone. You really just seeing the khuluq, the Muhammadan character really thoroughly embodied in some of these shuyukh was, to me, that was the most beautiful thing.
This is the real karama, huh? This is the real karama and ilham.
That's exactly. That's the real karama. I mean, people talk about walking on water, walking on the air, making it rain, making this happen, making that happen. But the real karama is to have that kind of, for your nafs to be so transformed and for you to be so transparent like that, I mean, everything they would do, everything they would say would remind me of a hadith or some story about the Prophet. Even things they do, and I said, oh, wow, that's really wonderful. And then I mentioned to a friend, and he said, that's the sunnah. That's this. They get, somebody serves some food, and they divide it up and give it to everyone. And then they take all of these different things. It's just the incredible adab that they had, not to mention then the knowledge that they had as well. When I would ask them a question in my stumbling Arabic, they would intuit the kind of motive behind the question and answer that. They would answer the question behind the question, usually. And many of them had this kind of deep insight and intuition.
And
so it was the real...
you're doing a great job trying to present such people in your academic work, in your articles, because I think even in the Arab world and the Persian world, they know nothing about the awliya or the mashayikh or the Sufiya, which are in Africa, especially in West Africa and the countries that you live in. So there is a light, a nur there, and a manifestation of the يعني الحقائق والنبوية in your society that we don't know. That's a great job, I think.
Oh, alhamdulillah, that's what I feel that's my job, because really, if you're missing out on that, you're missing out on a lot. Because most people in West Africa, they know about the shuyukh in Egypt, in the Middle East, they even know many Persian shuyukh, but unfortunately, it's not the other way around. So in West Africa, we feel like we have this abundance of riches because we know you, but you don't know us. So we're trying. Or not us, you don't know the great awliya and mashayikh there, and it's a real loss for people not to know about Sheikh Uthman Dan Fodio or Sheikh Amadou Bamba or Sheikh Ibrahim Niass or the great awliya of Timbuktu. Timbuktu is one of the most amazing places I've ever been in my life. It's one of those places where just dhikr comes to you naturally. It's just like breathing there. Just automatic. If you have that kind of sensitivity, when I was in Jerusalem once, it was like that as well too, or around certain maqams of awliya. But the whole city of Timbuktu, they call it the city of 333 saints because there's so many awliya buried there. Certain old parts of Cairo, Istanbul, you have the same kind of thing where you just get in that neighborhood and the barakah becomes really palpable. And Timbuktu is...
In which country Timbuktu?
It's in Mali. It's in Mali. It's in Mali. It's incredible, and there's still scholars, incredible scholars there to this day. And it's easy for, they're all fluent in Arabic. I mean, they can all run circles around. They're the best Arabists I've ever met in my life. Several of them were members of Academy of Letters of Morocco, of Iraq, because they learn real deep, like they learn the maqamat of Hariri. They learn really, really serious. They compose diwans which don't use any dots. They have incredible balagha, and they're really, really strong in sciences of lugha. So it's easy. Anyone who speaks Arabic can go there and meet with them and speak with them.
And so, Doctor, in this introduction, you mentioned from the Western Academia, Professor James Morris. You'd like to mention any other teacher that you learned too much from him?
Oh, I mean, so I've corresponded with Dr. Sayyid Hossein Nas extensively, email and other correspondence. I had the opportunity to meet with him in Washington a few times. Dr. Ghulam Reza Avani, Dr. Chittick, I've also corresponded with as well too, and he's provided some really, really useful assistance. Then this person, we're about age mates, Dr. Yusuf Kasewit as well. We send each other our translations and discuss things. We both have a real love for this figure, Afifuddin Tilimsani, who was Ibn Arabi student and also Qunomi student. And so I've learned a great deal from him as well. I hope I'm not forgetting anyone. Oh, and also in African studies, and study of Islamic Africa, my advisor Usman Khan, who's incredible. He's the grandson of Sheikh Ibrahim Yas, and he's a professor at Harvard. So he's had a full traditional Islamic education. He's Hafid Quran and everything. And he's a professor at Harvard. So, mashallah, I've learned a lot from him. And also Zachary Wright, who's done a number of great works on the Tijaniya. I've learned a lot from him as well. And Professor Rudolph Ware is an excellent historian of Muslim West Africa and knows Tasawwuf there very, very well. And for all of these people, Tasawwuf is not just an academic subject of study, but they really, they practice it, they live it, they're muhakkikun, they're the people who verify, who realize the truths that they talk about, and that shows in their work.
MashaAllah, such a blessed and a great experience, inshallah. Zadakallah. So let us delve more in the issues that we plan to talk about. So in the beginning, I'd like to start from your article, Annihilation in the Prophet, Al-Fanaء fi al-Nabi, Tariqun lil-Fanaء fi Allah. And this will take us obviously to the concept of the God of beliefs and the issue of pluralism. So we will discuss them together. But in the beginning, if you'd like to give us a summary about this article. So annihilation in the messenger, Al-Fanaء fi al-Rasul, have been presented as a step in the process to annihilation in God, الفناء في الله. Obviously, يعني من أراد الله بدأ به أو من أحبه فقد أحب الله. In the ayah, إن كنتم تحبون الله فاتبعوني. So اتباع comes first in order to reach to God. This is the obvious approach that we know. However, you presented another approach, which is found by some modern Sufis, Ibn Arabi and Ayn al-Qudha and others also, where they state that the station of Fanaء fi al-Rasul comes after the annihilation in God, al-Fanaء fi Allah, consisting the beginning of the station of subsistence, which is al-Baqa. So after al-Safar min al-Khalq ila al-Haq, we come back in the Safar between Khalq. So just explain to us the difference between the two approaches and the second one.
I think, mashallah, I think you've explained it, but I mean, it's essentially, there's not really a difference. It's just in the Western literature on Fanaء fi Rasul, I only saw the first half presented, the journey from creation from Khalq to Haq, through the intermediary of the Prophet, through Fanaء fi Rasul. So yeah, so I found in the Western literature on Fanaء fi Rasul, I was only able to find discussions of Fanaء fi Rasul as leading to Fanaء fi Allah, as being part of the journey, the Sayr from Khalq to Haq, from creation to God. But in the Arabic Sufi literature, I found there are two kinds. One is going up to, from Khalq to Haq. The other one is the beginning of Baqa. So one is kind of the door to Fana, and the other is the door to Baqa. And so I wanted to bring this out and the significance of this second aspect, this second scheme. And they're not contradictory at all. It's kind of like the first is the door to Fana Fillah, and then the other one is the door from Fana Fillah to Baqa Billah, the journey from Haq back to Khalq. And that's only, both of them are following in the footsteps of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, both of them, but they're kind of different stages in the journey. And this was really clear in the contemporary Tijani literature, which said first the Sheikh tries to get you through dhikr to experience Fana Fillah, and then, but this only occurs through the mediation of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. But then after that, the Sheikh encourages you to keep going to achieve annihilation in the Prophet, who is described as one of the attributes of God. And they said if you don't achieve this, you can't go any further. This kind of Fana fi Rasul is necessary for the continuation of the journey. And so the rest of the article tries to explain and understand, why is this the case? Why isn't Fana Fillah enough? Why do you have to do more? And then what is so special about the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam that what is needed to continue is to achieve annihilation in him, which then brings us to one explanation for this that's particularly influential and that really helped me understand it, is Ibn al-Arabi's idea of God's created in belief. Basically the idea that the forms of God that we worship are delimited, muqayyad, by our own consciousness, by our own understanding, by our beliefs. So we construct a God out of beliefs and we worship that. But in doing so, we're actually, he says, just worshiping ourselves. Because whoever praises something that's made by someone else is actually praising the maker of that. So the question is, well, how do we get beyond this? How can we get beyond just worshiping?
Well, actually, we're praising a concept of God which we built it ourselves by our
Exactly.
conceptions.
Exactly. So when we praise, so it's like if I make a statue, right? I make an idol and you praise the idol or the statue, say, oh, that's so beautiful. You're actually praising me, right? I'll be very happy. I say, oh, yes, I did. Or I wrote a paper. You say, mashallah, what a great paper. I'll be very happy.
But to the extent of our limited abilities, this is only what we can do, because people are limited, so we can construct a conceptual understanding about God, and we believe that we are worshiping God. So if you just explain it in a more deeper way.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's exactly it. So we have a certain belief about God. Those beliefs are delimited. It's one thing, it's not another. God is like this, God is not like that. But God is beyond any such delimitations. Allahu Akbar. Subhana rabbika rabbi amma izati amma yasifun. God's beyond whatever they claim of him. And so all these beliefs are claims, they're descriptions, they're delimitations of the absolute reality of the divine. And so how do we get beyond this? Ibn al-Arabi says, well, what you do is you follow the messenger. And he uses the example of mirrors. So he says, if you show something in a mirror, the reflection that appears in that mirror is going to be delimited by the shape and the color of that mirror. So if you have just a dirty mirror, or a mirror that's made out of brass or silver, that's going to influence the color, the shape, the size. All of that's going to be determined by the shape of the mirror. And he says these mirrors are like our constitutions. We all come from different places, climates, we have different histories, different things have happened to us, and that determines the shape of our mirror. And that then our mirrors then delimit the tajalliyat, the manifestations of God that can be manifest to us, and that's what creates these delimited, restricted concept notions of God that we have. But alhamdulillah, the Prophet and those who follow in his footsteps have perfect mirrors. Their mirrors are more perfect than ours. And so the manifestations that appear therein are as undistorted as can be. And so what you need to do is to try to follow the Prophet and try to approximate his mirror. So one example I give is if I have a mirror and there's a little bit of sunlight bouncing around and it comes in there, but there's a mirror, if I can't see the sun directly, if there's a mirror outside that has a direct view on the sun, if I want to see the sun, the best way for me to see the sun is to look in that mirror if my view of the sun has been blocked. And so he says that's why you have to look to the Prophet. And he gives this wonderful story which the Tijani tradition repeats again. Sheikh Ibrahim Yas quotes this verbatim in one of his letters, that so Ibn Arabi says this, that a man claimed that he had experienced God, had achieved Fana, and someone told Abu Yazid that, and he said, that's nice. And then Abu Yazid walked past the man saw Abu Yazid and he died. He just passed out and he died. And they said, Abu Yazid, what happened? Why did this man who had, said he had seen God and experienced Fana, why did he die when he see you? He said, well, he experienced God to the measure of his capacity. But when he looked at me, he saw God in the measure of my capacity, which was too much for him. And he says, nobody has the capacity, the preparedness of the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so that's why looking to him and worshiping his Lord, ila rabbika muntaha, like to your Lord, whose Lord is that? Worshipping the Prophet's Lord is what will take you beyond the delimited conceptions of the God that you worship. So instead of worshiping the God that you've created with your own conceptual constructions and your own beliefs, worship that of the Prophet, who has himself transcended all conceptual constructions and delimitations. And so that's what then takes you beyond your own limited personal notion to recognize God in all of the different delimited forms that he can take on. Mm-hmm. So it's polishing your mirror, following the Prophet, but in doing so, then you do what Ibn Arabi calls untying your knots. He uses great play in i'tiqad, it's a word for belief, and also in knotting. And he says, so the goal of the Muhammadans, those who follow in the footsteps of the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, is to go beyond these limited, restricted, knotted down conceptions or beliefs of God, to recognize God as he is.
Even if we try to understand this ayah, Subhanallah amma yasifun illa ibadallah al-mukhlasin. So
exactly.
They can describe God, so we can through them try to reach or understand God in a better way.
Precisely. If you just do it on your own, if you just read from your own page, as they say, you will limit yourself.
Your own page is polluted.
Yes, your own page is polluted. This is why Imam Ghazali gave this instruction when he said reading the Quran is don't try to read the Quran through what you've heard other people say about aqidah or fiqh, or that you should try to read the Quran openly. Allow God to speak to you, because the Quran is, aqidah comes from the Quran doesn't come from aqidah. Right? The reality of the divine transcends any conceptual construction, any discursive description that we can give of it. And yeah, exactly. The only way to really get there and to really understand that, though, aside from just divine grace coming down and grabbing you, is to follow one of these people who have transcended their own idols of belief. And those are the prophets, and particularly the Prophet Muhammad.
Great. You also mentioned in this article and in the article about Mيرسيا إلياد, in the end of it, that Ibn Arabi expands this idea and talks about a heart should be capable or receptive of all different forms. And then also Junaid has this famous saying, لون الماء بلون إنائه, so you have to be able to consider all different colors. I think also I quote from your article, Ibn Arabi argues that our particular constitutions, the limitations which make us individuals, color and shape our belief and knowledge of God, just as the form of a mirror shapes the images that appear within it, or a cup colors the water poured onto it. Because of this, most people simply end up worshipping a God created in belief, a constructed idea of God bound by one's own particular limitations. But then, yeah, and you mentioned in the article of Mيرسيا إلياد, this idea also that so beware lest you restrict yourself to a particular tenet, for you would forfeit the true knowledge of what is the reality. Therefore, be completely and utterly receptive to all doctrinal forms, for God Most High is too all-embracing and great to be confined within one creed or another. And then you mentioned the famous poems of Ibn Arabi, my heart has taken on any
Sadaq.
form. Or, yeah, so if you expand on this idea also.
Yeah, so this is exactly where this leads to essentially uh, we tend to think of God as being transcendent and being out there. But Ibn Arabi points out that this transcendence actually limits God, because you're saying God is out there, he can't be here. So he said for God to be truly transcendent, he must transcend his transcendence and be both transcendent and immanent. That's real transcendence. So God is all encompassing. Another in the Futuhat, he says, among the perfections of wujud is that it includes imperfections. And if it didn't include the imperfections, it would not be perfect. And so that there's this all-encompassing nature. So the God transcends any and all doctrinal descriptions, any accounts of him. But because God is the real, al-haq, he's also immanent in all of them, because they have some reality. So it's almost as if you have a cup made of ice and then water poured into the cup. It's all the real. The believers, the things they believe, what they believe in, it's all the real. But it's very, very difficult to recognize that truly. It's easy to just say kumbaya, okay, it's all good. But it's very, very difficult to actually see that. And in all of these diverse and dizzying forms of belief, to recognize the real in each of them, recognize the aspects of the real that are revealed, recognize the aspects of the real that are concealed in each of these forms of the belief, because all of them delimit the real to a certain. None of them are, in a certain sense, everything is the real as such, but in another sense, everything is a delimitation or restriction of al-haq. And to be able to see the reality behind the forms is not very easy. Now, this doesn't mean that it's all good and that every form of belief leads to felicity in the same way. Everything comes from God. Everything goes back to God. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un, right? But that return can be felicitous, blissful, peaceful, happy. You can return to the names of Jamal through the names of Jamal, or that return can be rigorous, tough, hard. It's like you can go happily running, yay. You know, like you see little kids when they go to a restaurant or a playground or something, they're happy. Or you can go kicking and screaming, like you see little kids being dragged to some place they don't want to go. You know, like the Quran says, there's no man min dabatin, there's no crawling creature, but God has it by the forelock. So you can be dragged kicking and screaming back to God, or you can go happily. There are paths of felicity, there are paths of peace, and then there are paths that are more rigorous, that are tough. And that depends on the understanding and the limitation of the real. The understanding of the real that is the most felicitous is this total one, is this one that is able to recognize the real in all of the different forms when it comes to them. Because then when you're recognizing the real everywhere, even if something hurts, you recognize the hurt as coming from your beloved, and so it's experienced as a kind of joy as well too. So this is the way of the Muhammadans, which Ibn Arabi sometimes calls Hira, because it's not or bewilderment, because it's not a fixed particular dogma or doctrine, but rather it's a fluid state of taqallub, of constant changing of the heart that is with like the Quran says, Kullu yawmin huwa fi sha'n. Every day he's on a new affair, a new task. The perpetual tajalliyat from the real. And only a heart that's infinitely flexible and receptive can receive all of them and recognize all of them. Most of us, we receive some and we reject a lot of others. Ibn Arabi uses this hadith of Tanawul on the day of judgment, that God comes to people in a form and they don't recognize him in it and they reject him. And he changes and comes to them in a form in which they recognize, and then they say, ah, yes, this is our Lord, and they follow him across the Sirat. Ibn Arabi says this isn't just the day of judgment. This is happening all the time now. God is constantly coming to us in all these tajalliyat. And most of us think we're acting out of good adab to God by rejecting these forms. but we're not actually acting
For
out of
example,
adab.
how we ordinary people, how do we reject some forms of the manifestations of God?
Yeah, it could be something as simple as, you know, somebody yells at you in traffic, somebody honks on the horn. You have some difficulty. You have Donald Trump becomes president. We have all of these different things that can happen to us. It can be the form of a belief of somebody else that you don't understand, that you don't like, that offends you. Um, the key, it's not necessarily that you let's say there's something like I don't know, some made up tradition that's clearly made up. Somebody just made it up like there's this Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster, something like that. Somebody made it up as a way to mock religion, right? It doesn't mean that I think, oh yes, the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster is going to lead people to felicity. Is going to is a valid religion that is good for people to follow. But rather you can recognize, okay, what's actually being worshipped in the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster? What are these, whether they're aware of it or not, what are these people doing when they go to this ridiculous church and do these kinds of things? And then what is the proper adab towards that tajalli of the real? What is the proper adab? What's the proper response to that? Because not all responses are the same, right? Different tajalliyat, you have to have different ways of responding to different tajalliyat. So among the Sufis in Senegal, and Ainu Qudat also says this as well, that when you curse Iblis, that's actually his food. Lanatullah alayhi. That that's like almost like sending salawat on him. He enjoys that. That's the
He
proper adab.
deserves that.
Well, he deserved this. There's all kinds of interpretations of Iblis, like, you know, with Anakudat Hamadani, that he's a real lover of God, that he knew what God was commanding him to do. And anyway, there are all kinds of different interpretations, because he had a very high station with God at the beginning. And so that means as they say, it will be in the beginning as it was, in the end it'll be as it was in the beginning. So there are all kinds of different interpretations of Iblis. But if you recognize Iblis as a manifestation of the name, let's say Amudil, if you recognize Iblis as a manifestation of the real, the appropriate adab isn't to just follow everything he says, to embrace him like that. The appropriate adab is lanatullah alayh, the curses for him. So there's different adab for all of these different tajalliyat.
What about the false beliefs? Because I think Ayn al-Qudha al-Hamadani and Dr. Rustum and Dr. Nicholas, they talked about his theories. So we have false beliefs also. We have the divine beliefs that manifested in different religions. We can find wisdom in them. We can find truth in them. To a certain extent, it depends on different doctrines and theological understandings and conceptualizing God and the divine reality. But then we have false beliefs, like people, like you said, this church or new religions, or people who just state things that are logically, we can't construct them logically. For example, there are 12 gods that are ruling the world, for example. So these false beliefs, they are false. And they would send a person to the majestic names of God, which is hell, for example. But you're referring here that we should see the real and the manifestation of God, which is the other side of this thing. Or just like Ayn al-Qudha, when we see the people who said there are Thanawiyya, two gods, they reached to this conclusion because they couldn't they couldn't connect shurur to Allah. So there is a divine essence of their belief. This is what you mean?
Exactly. This is what I mean. So you find if something were completely false, it could not exist. There's always a glimmer of truth in whatever is said. So even exactly like Ayn al-Qudat explained with all of these different things. So the job of the Arif, of the Muhammadan then, is to recognize what is real, what is actually reflected of the real in there, and then also what is concealed. So you can tell if you see the shadow of someone walking, you can tell something about the person from the shadow, even though the shadow is not that person. Right? So even in these made up very silly beliefs, there's a part of the real that is revealed in them. Otherwise, they couldn't exist. Right? There has to be something. They have to get something right. Right? There's a saying in English: a broken clock is right twice a day. right? Even if it's stopped, twice a day it's right. So the job of the arif is to recognize what's correct there, what of the real is manifest in there, but then also what is concealed. And in recognizing what is wrong or what is concealed, you can also see the real. Just as in a shadow, you can tell something of the person casting the shadow. So this is, I think, what Ibn Arabi is referring to in his famous poem and in places in the Fusus and other things, where he says you have to recognize the real in all of these forms of belief. It's much easier in the forms of, you can say, that are clearly from prophetic, from revelation. You know, it's in a certain sense it's much easier. It's much harder in forms of revelation that are more distant from us, like I say, distant in time or distant in geography. And it's even harder with some of these made up kooky things that you have. But that's what an arif is someone who recognizes.
So it's a very high spiritual state where
it's a very high
God, he sees the face of God, so
exactly.
he can witness God in all his signs and all his manifestations.
Exactly. But that's a very high station, and it's distinct from. It's good to have mutual understanding and, you know, tolerance, you could say, but mutual understanding and recognition between people of different prophetic traditions. That's good. But what Ibn Arabi is talking about is a degree beyond that, of saying like, oh, I recognize that the Christians have real piety. I recognize that the Jews have real piety. That you know, these Buddhists or other people have you know, have real piety and have some truth. What he's talking about is this recognition of the real in all of its various delimitations and forms. And that's something that's a great station.
So
That's actually, technically that's the station of no station. That's maqam la maqam. It's because it's not tied down to a particular station. It's not a particular perspective on the real. But Ibn Arabi says it's like a continuous orbit around the real, in which you're continuously seeing new facets, new dimensions of the real. It's constantly changing. That's why he calls it the station of no station. It's not fixed. It's not one particular station, but rather flows through all stations.
So it has nothing to do with the relativism, as just some people try to say, but it's something that related to the المراتب التشكيكية لمعرفة الله.
I mean, in fact, it's the exact opposite of relativism in a certain, or it's the transcendence of the binary between absolutism and relativism. Because what it really is it's understanding what al-itlaq, what al-mutlaq, what the absolute really is. And if the absolute is truly absolute, it has to flow through and be present in all of the relative delimitations. So it's not relativism at all, that, you know, all these positions are just relative, there's no truth. No, but it's based on a real understanding of what the absolute is. And if it's absolute, it has to be infinite. And if it's infinite, it has to flow through all of these different delimitations. And to recognize that that's an absolute. In fact, Ibn Arabi says, you know, this is the Ahlullah, the property of God flows over them. The property of God is to be non-delimited. And so they're also not, this is one of the things what it means to be made in the image of God. God is completely non-delimited. And so those who achieve that station, who really live up to the human potential of being made in the image of God, are themselves also non-delimited. They're not restricted by any mode of belief or even being. You know, everybody else has a maqam ma'loom, except for the Muhammadans, who they can kind of flow through every maqam. They're not limited by any station. They transcend all of the stations. And by
or even
exactly
all the universe.
All inclusive. Exactly, it's all inclusive. It's all inclusive. And so the Muhammadans as well, their mercy, their vision, their sight is also all inclusive. That's why the Prophet was sent as a mercy to all the worlds, not just to the Ummah, not just to people, but to all the worlds. And those who follow in his footsteps are likewise a mercy to all the worlds, likewise recognize the real in all of the worlds, not just in particular parts of some of the world.
I think, Doctor, also this theory has implications on the ethical and the practical side of the
Yes.
human being's life and his virtuous life and his مقامات السير, because he should try to seek the signs of God in every detail in life.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Well, there's a yes. So they'll try to seek. In a certain sense, though, you can't. In English, we have this phrase: fake it till you make it." In a certain sense, you can't fake it till you make it. So you can't be looking around, and a bird flies across the sky, and then you say, "Okay, that means I shouldn't take a flight today," or something like that. This can be a danger that some people can fall into. But yeah, for those who arrive by, usually through following the Sheikh, through following the Prophet, sometimes through more exceptional means at this, all the time they're just standing before their Lord. Everything that occurs to them, they perceive as coming from their Lord, as a manifestation of the real, and they perceive themselves as a manifestation of the real as well. Their consciousness is really transformed, and that has very profound ethical, as you mentioned, profound ethical implications as well too. So a lot of the things that those of us still struggling on the path, we work hard to do because we know it's the right thing to do, just become reflexive to people who this is the way you perceive the world. Even the mistakes they may make, they see as coming from, oh, this is a manifestation of God's wisdom and God's will in this way, and it manifested me in this particular way. So it's just a radical shift in
You can consider
consciousness.
the people more understand their mistakes and look at them from the top of the mountain, and you can have a better life. And this is a point that I always try to insist in, that there are many beauties in the Arfani doctrine, theoretical and practical beauties, that when a person studies them, he can know them more.
Absolutely, absolutely. And honestly, if you're studying Irfan and it's not improving you in your day-to-day interactions with, like, let's say your family, which can be the most difficult, or other people, then something's wrong. If you're studying Irfani doctrines and it's not helping you, not only in your dhikr or your salat, your prayers, your recitations, but it's not helping you in your interactions with your family or with other people, then that's a sign that something's not quite right. Something's not quite connecting. I mean, there's many practical examples. Some of the Tijani Shuyukh I mentioned, when I asked them about these practical implications of these doctrines and the realization, they told me the story of Aisha, who gave a gift to a beggar but perfumed it and wrapped it up very nicely and gave it to the man. And the Prophet asked her, "Why did you do this?" And she said, "Well, I know it's the hand of God that's receiving it. I know it's Yadullah that's receiving it." And they said, this is the perspective of Marifa. Ibn Arabi says, when giving charity, what you're actually doing is you're just giving owners back their property from the perspective of Marifa. So you don't feel good about, you don't feel that good about yourself if you repay a debt. If God's giving you this property that actually belongs to somebody else, and so you're just holding it in trust, and then you deliver the trust when the time is right. So it's a real shift in perspective on so many behaviors.
Actually, the poor person did the good to you because he offered the
exactly because he accepted it from you. Exactly. So you'll be thanking the person for this. And it's interesting. You see this in a lot of folk cultures as well too. There's a funny story. Senegalese. It's a modern novel, but it's based on an older folk tale called the Beggars' Strike, in which these beggars, to complain of their horrible treatment by this politician, go on strike. They don't receive they won't take alms from anyone anymore. And as a result, this politician has this incredible downfall, because the thing he needs to do in order to keep himself in power is to give this money to these beggars, and they refuse to accept it, and that leads to his downfall. So you have this kind of folk wisdom and tradition, but you see it more elaborated in kind of more sophisticated modes in Ibn al-Arabi and the Irfani tradition as well. So it has profound ethical ramifications. That's the interesting thing about Marifa, Irfan, Sufism in general. You can't have one without the other. You can't have the conceptual understanding without the ethical conformity to the real. and you can't really have the ethical conformity to the real without some form of understanding as well too. The two are mutually reinforcing. So the aspects of truth that are
philosophy and mysticism between aql and qalb. You mentioned this in one of the articles. We'll come back to it, but here, before we go to our second part of this talk, so let us talk a bit about the barakah of the Prophet and the maqam al-Muhammadi. So I think you mentioned one of the poems at the end of this article. The two worlds seek to please God. God seeks to please Muhammad. Muhammad is the door to God. God is the door to Muhammad. A poem by Ahmed Riza Khan Bariwali. So you talk about this amazing subject, which is also here about the state of the Prophet. If you just like to comment.
Oh man, talking about the state of the Prophet, I think it's too, as we say in Yoruba, it's too big for my mouth. But basically, it's that of, in Akbari cosmology, the Insan al-Kamil, the one who unites being and non-being, the real and creation. Ibn al-Arabi calls him the Haqiqatul Muhammadiyya, the third thing that stands between being and nothingness, haq and khalq, truth and falsehood, and kind of unites them and comprises them in a mysterious way. The way I usually like to speak about it, that I think is an image that is the easiest for us to think with, is that of a dream and the dreamer. So if you imagine God as a dreamer, so astaghfirullah, God goes to sleep and has a dream. God dreams all of creation into existence. God has to be present in that dream in a certain way in order for the dream to be a dream, right? So if you go to sleep and you dream that, I don't know, you're LeBron James, something like that, you are present in the dream through the LeBron James character. You interact with the dream in that way, and it's actually through that LeBron James character that the whole dream is kept in existence. If LeBron James were to disappear in the dream, you would disappear, you as the dreamer would disappear from the dream, and there'd be no more dream. And so this is what the Prophet is. He's the one who kind of combines all the worlds within himself. He's the one through which God looks into the, just like you kind of look through LeBron James's eyes into the dream. You have mercy on the dream. You interact with the people on the dream through LeBron James. As the Quran says, "Ma ramaita idha ramaita walakin Allahu rama." So if you're having a dream and you shoot a free throw, it wasn't LeBron James who shot the free throw when he shot the free throw, but rather you, Hadi, in your dream, you shot the free throw. So this is the Prophet, and then those who are his representatives afterwards among the Ahl al-Bayt, amongst the awliya, who take on this role of really holding the whole cosmos in existence, and through whom God has mercy on the cosmos, through whom God knows the cosmos in a particular way. I mean, so the station of the barakah of the Prophet is something that, I mean, as many poets and other people have said, bewilders all intellects, because it's that which combines all opposites and transcends them. In a certain sense, it's more straightforward to talk about. In a certain sense, it's more straightforward to talk about God as kind of transcendent, real, this, that.
And we don't know about him. He's very absolute. He's very great that we don't know about him.
Exactly. But the Prophet is, in a certain sense, God's transcendence of his transcendence. And so it's that ray of light that then brings the whole cosmos into existence, holds it into existence, and returns it back to God.
What about the poem here? Because the poem states the two worlds seek to please God, and then God seeks to please Muhammad. So how can we understand such a sentence? Because
I mean, so basically God's
creator, then he will seek to
so God's goal, the goal of existence in essence is the Prophet. So our goal, we are all seeking God. What is God's, if you can speak of God's goal, why did God create the world? So there's that Sufi kind of hadith Qudsi, that I was a hidden treasure and I love to be known, so I created the creatures that they might know me. Who's the greatest knower of God? Who's the greatest lover of God? Is the Prophet. Or Ibn Arabi begins his Fusus, says when the real wished to see his reflection in a form. It was basically saying when the real wished for to see his reflection in a particular kind of form. Who's that particular form? It's the Prophet. So the Shabastari has this great image in which I think I quote some other places in which he describes creation as non-being is a mirror, creation is the reflection of the mirror, and humanity, particularly the Prophet, is the pupil of the reflected pupil of the eye, through which the whole thing comes to be in the first place. So it's the reflected eye, and using this play on words, insan in Arabic, means both pupil and human being. So it's the reflected pupil of the reflected eye. That's the Prophet. So God created creation in order to see himself, in order to witness himself in a particular total mode that combined all of his names and attributes. And the most perfect reflection, the most perfect recipient of that manifestation is the Prophet. So the kind of goal of creation, God's goal for the divine action of creation is the Prophet. And so that's why this is, they say God seeks to please Muhammad. God is seeking Muhammad. Yeah, so that's how I understand that poem.
Great. Sallallahu alayhi wa
sallam. Yeah.
So we'll go to another topic, which is Mيرسيا إلياد, and we'll try to find some comparative analysis here, because I think there is a mystical dimension for Mيرسيا إلياد also, and that's why you write about him, I think. So I was going through the very interesting article. So the summary will be that the transcendent sacred manifests itself in different modalities into the plane of profane history, creating hierophanies, I think you mean manifestations, and historical events which reveal or manifest a given modality of the sacred. And this could be recognized by the language of symbolism. So what's the main point that you're trying to emphasize here in this article, especially about his theory about the sacred and the profane? And can we consider it another expression, another language about the Irfani doctrine, which is the manifestation of God names and qualities all around history and places?
I think it's similar. I don't think it's exactly identical. But so the reason I chose this was when we're taking a theory and methods course, and we were reading Eliade. I said, wow, this sounds a lot like Ibn Arabi. This hierophany sounds a lot like Tejlli. And so I said, wow, this really sounds interesting. So I wrote this paper to try to figure out what was similar, what was different, and to actually experiment with Eliade's method and see how it worked. So I think there are a number of similarities between Eliade's method and, let's say, the Irfani perspective. Hierophany is a good translation of Tajalliyat. Epiphany, a kind of hierophany literally means a kind of manifestation of the sacred. So that's very close. But for Eliade, it's there's a sacred and there's a profane. For Ibn al-Arabi and the Irfani tradition, there's no profane. There's just different.
Everything's the manifestation of God.
Exactly. They're just different modalities of the sacred. Even the things that are seen as, let's say, haram or najas or things like that are manifestations of particular names. That's why they have that status. And there's this interesting thing in Arabic and a lot of other ancient languages that, haram and haram have the same root. The sacred and the forbidden are very closely related because they're the places of power, of powerful manifestations. So there's a difference there. As I think that's probably the main difference, and also that there's not this division between the sacred and profane history, because history itself is, Ibn Arabi talks about the Allah. That's also just different tajalliyat of different asma and sifat, different names and qualities. And so, yeah, there are some important differances between, although there are a lot of.
Can we understand what he means by profane? So profane, it's a places where there is no clear manifestation of God. So how can we understand it? I think because he doesn't have the Irfani doctrines of God names and qualities. So he believes that when God manifests in certain time of history, ayyamullah, in certain events, in certain sacred places, so we can see His presence more. Otherwise, there is some profane أماكن مدنسة لا تعكس حضوره كثيرا يحصل فيها الفساد. نور الله غير حاضر فيها بقوة. So we can understand him from this.
Yeah, you can understand him from this perspective. You also what he was trying to do was also a bit different. So he was trying to look at all of these phenomena called religious around the world and try to understand what they have to do with each other and kind of come up with a universal schema of what's going on here, and then to relate different things that appear similar in different places around the world. So, for example, you have like the example of the black stone. You have a meteorite that comes from heaven to earth, and then people make pilgrimage to it and circumambulate that. You have very similar things all around the world, where a meteorite comes down and people use it as an axis mundi and may circumambulate it. And so he will look around and says, okay, so this meteorite coming to earth is a hierophany. It's an eruption of the sacred into ordinary kind of profane life. It manifests a particular modality of the sacred, in which the sacred appears in a particular form, and then these rituals and other things and myths are built up around it, and that creates this kind of modality of the sacred that's revealed in profane history and time in different places around the world. So that's Eliade was trying to look at everything from what people do in pre-Columbian, like before 1492, Central America and in South Africa and in India and in various places, and try to understand what they have to do with each other and how they're all manifesting different modalities of the same sacred. And so there's a parallel to that in what we were talking about earlier with Ibn al-Arabi and recognizing the real in all of its different manifestations. But one of the things that I like about Ibn al-Arabi a bit more is, in a certain sense, he gets inside the, he's not looking at these things kind of from the outside. He advocates looking at it from the inside. So when the Sabaeans say they worship the sun, what do they really mean? What are they doing when they're worshiping the sun? And in fact, he has, in this Futuhat, he talks about his conversations he had with the Sabaean about, and he said, oh no, they're not actually worshiping the sun. This is what they're doing, these names and qualities. And then also there's not a kind of profane, ordinary, non-sacred life, as you said. Everything is names and qualities of God, and they're just interacting in different ways. But that's one of the reasons why, I mean, there's some other issues with Eliade too, but these I think are the two differences between.
This is actually the main or the real difference between Western academia or an outsider and the traditional Islamic academia, and being insider, trying to delve inside the things and understand the light of these realities, not only setting aside and trying to study them. So you mentioned also the stone and the Kaaba, so we can understand the symbolism of the Hajar al-Aswad and the Kaaba from his theory, also from Miliada's theory.
You can understand it like that as well. But as you know, the Islamic tradition is very rich with its own sets of what's going on with the Hajar al-Aswad. It blackening from sins, and then it also being a kind of symbol of the divine essence. This kind of black, inscrutable, the symbolism is really polyvalent. So one way to understand it is, yes, it comes down from the sky, it makes a place, and so that creates a kind of what they call an axis mundi, like a pole, qutub, connecting heaven and earth.
A manifestation of Bayt al-Ma'mur in some of the riwayat.
Exactly, of Bayt al-Ma'mur, the heavenly archetype of the house, and the connection between the two. So you can understand it like that. But the black stone has lots and lots of, one of the most amazing things I love about the Futuhat is Ibn al-Arabi will take you through like wudu or salat, or just the thing of the way in which you hold your hands in salat, and you'll have like 6 or 8 different symbolic understandings of what's going on when you do that. They're not contradictory, but there's so many different ways. That's the amazing thing about these kinds of rituals and symbols, is that they admit of, and ayahs, like the Quranic ayahs, there's not just one meaning. It's not just doesn't just have one thing to which it refers. It's full of meaning, and so it has so many different meanings and so many different understandings that you can glean from it. And the same is true for things like the black stone, the positions of the body in prayer, etc.
I guess one value added also in philosophy of religion, and you have an article about Sahrawardi and this stuff, we can talk about it a bit, but a value added for the Western scholars, also people like Mيرسيا, إلياد, that they have a very wide understanding of many different religions and rituals and sectors throughout history, which is not found in our own tradition. Our own tradition, maybe they'll study about Plato, Socrates, and Hikmat al-Anwar, some of the philosophers, and then they'll come to Islamic Sufis and scholars. But they have a wider range of understanding all different kinds of religions, where they can help you. If you have a mystical approach to such ideas, they can help you in presenting more examples or more rituals, maybe.
Yeah, but I also wouldn't underestimate. I mean, if you ever read Shahrazuri's Shajarat al-Ilahiyya, or even Mullah Sadra's Asfar, the number of different and the understanding of, because I mean, Afghanistan was mainly Buddhist at one time, and you know all the neighbors were Muslim. So people really, or Al-Biruni's work on India, or the work of some of these Muslim scholars in Mughal India, they really some of them really understood different schools of Hindu thought very, very well, different schools of Buddhist and other thought, in addition to ancient Greek thought. In fact, Mullah Sadra's Asfar is a really good source for reconstructions of Greek manuscripts that have been lost later on. So it was like, okay, the skeptics said this, and the Stoics said this, and these groups said this and that and the other thing. It's very, very comprehensive of a lot of these different positions.
Even Mir, which is one of the
exactly.
sources of Sadra, but we don't know too much about him, but he had interest in the Eastern philosophy.
Exactly. Yeah, one of my colleagues here at UVA, Shankar Nair, has an excellent book, Translating Wisdom, on Mir Finderisky and some of these other Safavid and Mughal scholars who studied a lot these Eastern traditions. But that being said, you're right. I mean, there's a lot to learn in contemporary Western scholarship about various different traditions all over the world. Things that boggle the imagination. You couldn't imagine it, but they're there. And so there's a lot of. So I think there's a lot we can learn in terms of exposure, as you said, to different traditions. Things we haven't, that aren't well represented or well described in the traditional sources. But also I think the Western academic tradition has a lot to gain and learn from the Irfani tradition as well too.
Going back to philosophy of religion in the traditional sense, you talk about Shishtari and Sahrawardi in one of your articles, and then you mentioned that the third section lists a kind of a genealogy of seekers of knowledge, praising their qualities. You're talking about a certain poem, and then you include a list which includes the Greek figures of Hermes, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Alexander the Great. I think you mean Dhul Qarnayn. Famous Sufis starting from Hallaj, Ghazali, Ibn Arabi, Ibn al-Farid, as well as Islamic philosophers Ibn Sina, Ibn Tufayl, Ibn Rushd, Sahrawardi. So they're all engaged in the same quest for truth that the poem you're mentioning is describing them. So this is insists about the very wide approach of our philosophy of religion in our poetry.
Yeah, that's what Shishtari says in his famous poem, the Nuniya. So he gives a kind of genealogy of people who he saw as being having the same goal, the same quest for wisdom, for knowledge of the truth, and includes all of these different people. And likewise, Suhrawardi, and in the commentaries on Suhrawardi in particular, Suhrawardi mentions Buddha and the Eastern sages and the Brahmins and these kinds of people as representing this hikmah atiqa, this ancient wisdom, this approach to philosophy and wisdom that's not just conceptual and mental, but also existential. And so, this is why I think one of the reasons why the Ishraqi tradition was used a lot to interpret when people came across Buddhist and various forms of Hindu and other dharmic traditions, they would use the Ishraqi tradition to try to interpret and understand it as a kind of their theory or their philosophy of religion. And you have this other thing, you have all kinds of interesting things going on in India when people also then have understandings of Islam that are they understand it through their dharmic traditions. So they understand the Prophet Muhammad as an avatar and then you even have Hindu pundits who write commentaries on the Fusus as well. So they're Hindu, they're practicing Hindus, but they study the Fusus. And
very interesting, huh?
very, very interesting, yeah. And they engage in debates about the Fusus and Hikmat al-Ishraq was studied. Well, I mean, it was
So a
studied by.
Hindu approach for the Irfan of Arabic.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. They have because they recognize wisdom there. They were in these Mughal courts where Ibn al-Arabi's, the Irfani Akbari tradition was popular, where Suhrawardi's Ishraqi philosophy was popular. So you have Hindu and Zoroastrian scholars taking up these philosophies and using them to express their own traditions and to
Vice
explain their
versa,
own
when, for
traditions.
example, Allama Tabatabai, he was explaining and teaching the Upanishad, and he was seeing
Exactly,
the Islamic wisdom through the Upanishad and Surah Al-Tawheed there also. So this
exactly,
vice versa, and the comparative studies from the two
exactly.
different angles.
From the two, and you notice that when these great ulama like Allama Tabatabai and other people do it, they do it in this different way from these two different angles. So they'll say, okay, so from the Irfani perspective, this is what I see in the Upanishads, and then from the Upanishadic perspective, this is what I see in Tawheed. So they keep them distinct, right? They don't just try to muddle them up and be all together. They keep them as distinct expressions and distinct perspectives on the truth, but they're able to achieve mutual recognition from each of them.
They respect their traditions because different languages, I think you talk about language, different
Yeah,
languages express the reality and truth in different ways.
exactly, exactly, exactly. So yeah, you see this with a lot of the great ulama when they've been next to or encountered different religious traditions, will have a certain understanding of it. Again, they'll be able to recognize the reality that's there in those traditions as well.
So talking about Hikmatul Ishraq, so is it manifested again, or is Sayyid Hussein Nasr, or the perennial school, or the Al-Hikmah Al-Khalida, the wisdom school you call it, or the is it a new or a modern manifestation of such type of thinking also, or in a conclusion, what I want to reach to is which kind of truth religious pluralism that we can construct out of such philosophies or theories?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are lots of different constructions that that can be made out of it, and I mean, there are lots of different versions. So like Sheikh Abdul Wahid Yahya, René Guénon's understanding of tradition and of different religions was slightly different from Fritjof Schuon's which is different from Sayyid Hossein Nasr's, which is very different from other people who've used the term perennial philosophy, like Aldous Huxley, um, and these kinds of things. What I think is important, more important than the formulation or the construction, is the realization. Is the realization of the real. So realizing the real, then you can speak. It's almost I forget, Ibn Arabi was talking about how you come to understand things in the Quran or in the world is first you encounter the real, and then you'll be able to recognize it in its signs, in its manifestations. So what's important first of all is to have that to follow that spiritual discipline, to have the encounter with the real, and then you'll be able to recognize the different manifestations and forms of the real, and understand the appropriate adab to them, because you get into such imponderables like, okay, is like abrogation of different revelations, or is this religion, is this particular tradition made up, or is it prophetic? Is it from God, or is it made up? Is it these are real things that ordinary human intellects can't, you can't really figure this kind of thing out on your own. I mean, there's certain criteria, like are you producing saints? What kind of quality of people are these traditions producing, etc. But a lot of these things are very difficult to sort out. But I do think you see, like in the works of Sayyid Hossein Nas, you do see a restatement of some of the same perspectives, or I should say similar perspectives, because again, la taqra fi tajalli, right? If he was saying the same thing right here, right now, as Suhrawardi was saying in 12th century Damascus, that wouldn't be fresh. Like Abu Madian said, give us fresh meat, right? If it's something fresh from the real. If it's fresh from the real, it'll appear different. Or as we said before, لون الماء لون الإناء. The color of water is the color of its container. If somebody has a red cup and then you have a blue cup, but you're giving me Kool-Aid. I know what you're giving me is not water. In this time, in this place, what comes from the real the essence will be the same, but the formalities, the formal presentation has to be different. You know, if you and I both, I'm a teacher, so you can always tell when people are plagiarizing when they say the same thing. I have 3 students who all say the exact same thing on an essay question. Then you know there's something wrong. The students who have really grasped it, they'll be able to tell you it in their own words. And so I think what's really important is the grasping and the understanding of this reality and the conformity of our souls, of ourselves to this reality. And then the expression will come from there. I think Shabastari also said when somebody asked him in this Gulshani Ra's poem about, you know, why is it that one Sufi says this, another Sufi says this, one says this, one says that? He said, look, they all had their experience of the real, and they all spoke from their particular standpoints, which were different. And if they were all the same, then there'd be a problem. Because they're different people in different places and different times, it should be different. Their expression should be different. But for one who's experienced it himself, he'll be able to recognize the same reality that they're talking about in all the different
جمالك واحد
expressions.
وأعيننا شتى وكل إلى ذاك الجمال.
وَالْكُلَّ ذَلِكَ الْجَمَالُ يُشِيرُ. Exactly. هذا هو. That's it.
But after studying all these different theories in pluralism and the perennial school, especially Dr. William Chittick, Dr. Reza Shah Kazimi, Said Hussein Nasser, all the other people that are trying to construct different theories from this truth pluralism. So, as a conclusion, if we want to be precise, given that as Muslims we believe that the Muhammadan state is the higher, or it abrogated all the other past sharia, so it's a more perfect way of worshipping God through. But how can we perceive other people who are sincere or trying to reach to God? So they will have the equal ability to reach towards God because God is just and merciful, or no, will be in a higher state, or no, the reaching to God is always open because it's a path of fitra and ilm al-huduri, knowledge by presence.
I mean, I think the Quran's, at least to me, the Quran is pretty clear on this. God will judge between you wherein you differ. It's up to us to strive and to compete with one another in good works and good actions. And God will judge when we differ. I don't see anything, I haven't seen any convincing arguments, whether from Aql or Naql, that the worst Muslim will be better than the best Christian, or something like that. It doesn't, you know, there are all of these verses like in Surah Baqarah, Surah Ma'idah, you know, the Jews and the Christians and those who believe La khawfun alayhim wa la hum yahzanun, which is exactly what they say about the awliya Allah, as well too. And also you have these people who the only thing they've never heard of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They've never heard of the Prophet, or all they've heard of the Prophet or seen people talk about the Prophet is on things like Fox News or people being aggressive in the streets or things like that.
But they weren't convinced due to obstacles, due to boundaries, language boundaries,
all kinds of things. So what I know of God and God's mercy, and the other thing too is there's the Prophet, there's Muhammad ibn Abdullah, and then there's the Haqiqatul Muhammadiyah, right? And there are some people who I think are very, very devout followers of the Haqiqatul Muhammadiyah. They're very devoted to the Haqiqatul Muhammadiyah, even if they don't know its manifestation as Muhammad ibn Abdullah. And so, but ultimately, it's God who will judge between us about where we differ, and it's our job to strive as hard as we can in this life to follow in the footsteps of the Prophet and to be real lovers of God. You know, that's the end of that poem you brought up by Ibn Arabi. You know, he says,
يدين بدين الحب يمين أن توجهت
yeah. Lana uswatun. You know, we have an example in Mace and Ghailan and Hind and Qais and Layla. You know, these were people who gave up everything for love, gave up status, gave up their clothes, gave up their lives for love. And he's in his commentary on this, he says, God made these people manifest as a rebuttal to those who claim to love him. So that these people were like this for merely human lovers. So how much more should you be, if you claim to love me, how much more should you be towards me? I mean, so these are our models. We have the models of the prophets, the Anbiya, the Rasul. We have the models of these great lovers of literature, and we're supposed to be like them. And we're supposed to be competing with each other and vying with those of other ummahs, those who are following al-Sharia in our love for God. And that's really, like you see in the Olympics, you have these different nations, and they're all competing to do different things. And that's the way I see it. We're trying to compete with one another in our love for and our devotion to God. And that will just spur us on to be better.
All humanity
so
can be on the same race. All humanity can try their
yeah,
best, and then God will judge
exactly. All humanity is trying their best. And when we get to the other side, God will inform us about, who's got the gold, who's got the silver. But it doesn't really, it doesn't affect me whether I get up for my prayers, whether I do my khalwas, whether I do my dhikr or something like that, whether Theravada Buddhism is accepted by God or not, or whether these particular Theravada Buddhists, if God is accepting their prayers and offerings. Honestly, he is struggling and striving. I should be struggling and striving too. But the thing is, when I read some of the works of these traditions, or when I meet with some of the people, the exemplars of these traditions, I can recognize truth in them. I can recognize truth in them, in the people, and in
their hearts, in the virtues, in what they embody. So as a
exactly.
conclusion, can we add an idea to this also, that the ethical or the virtuous or the spiritual side of a person, or loving God, as you said, or having these virtues and nobility, is the main thing, and it's more important than only the conceptual ideas or the theological doctrines, because it's the God of belief, which didn't ascend the limitations yet. So we can concentrate on the spiritual and the practical side of human being, more than only some of the concepts that are shaped due to different religions or theologies.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that they're always related, right? The conceptual will influence except for some very simple people who in a certain sense are kind of lucky, they don't have to deal with that. But for most people now, particularly now that Western education has spread everywhere, most people now, the conceptual will influence their ethical life, and the ethical life will influence the conceptual. I think I'm trying to say is that so two things. One thing is the Prophet said the character, every community has a characteristic khuluq, and the khuluq of Islam is haya. Is this kind of modesty, and you see this. The Quran, as far as with a few exceptions, only a few other traditions that I know of that explicitly mention other traditions, other prophets. There's a certain kind of modesty. And you see it in the life of the Prophet as well too, when he allowed different believers of following different sharia, not only to live in his community and he protected them, but to worship in places sacred to him, in the Masjid al-Nabawi and other places as well. There's a certain kind of modesty and humility there that God knows best. Wallahu a'lam. That I think is really important. And the real thing is to focus on your own. Transcending your own gods of belief that say, okay, this is what God is and God is not that. God is what I say it is. God is my understanding of Quran and Hadith, and God is not what is spoken about. God is not Shunyata in Buddhism. God is not Brahman Atman in Hinduism. God is not this. God is not that. Focus on transcending your own gods of belief, and then you can look around and see what you see. Then you can look around and see and see what you see. But until then, have humility. The Quran says again, God will judge about us when we differ.
No,
And
also that's a point. Maybe I think you agree also. Like, try to find God by knowledge of presence, by your purity, by your
exactly.
virtues, where you
I
find
see.
real knowledge of God, not only the sticking to theoretical tahalil and complications. This is what I mean, and this can be penetrated through different people of different religions.
Different religions, yeah, absolutely. So, and again, this too, though. So I see the conceptual understanding as being, when it's correct, as being a reflection of these higher levels of understanding. So when I mean, even as knowledge is a light, and God doesn't give light to the disobedient. Ittaqullah ya'allimukum Allah. Fear God, and God will teach you. Right? So what does that actually mean? When you conform to the truth in your behaviors, in your inward states, in your character, in your ethics, in a certain sense, you become the truth, and you can know the truth directly and intimately. And then that truth will then be reflected on the mental plane in these conceptual formulations. So sometimes, this is what I was trying to say, conceptual, if you have some of the wrong concepts, they can hinder, they can be knottings, they can be barriers to this ethical and existential development. And so I don't see it as an either or, like just focus on the ethical, the spiritual, forget about the conceptual. But I think the danger today for a lot of, particularly people studying Irfan, is that you just focus on the conceptual and you forget the spiritual, because it's way easier to read lots of these things and come up with conceptual diagrams than it is to like take a khalwa, or to not get angry, or to not say anything bad about someone for a year. We all have our things we need to work on, but that kind of serious riyada and self-discipline is much harder than forming these conceptual maps. Yeah, so I think you need both. You need both for the highest level. But if you have the ethical purity, if you have the spiritual discipline, and you have tawfiq, if God blesses you, then you'll be blessed with the conceptual understanding that will come as a result. The transformation of your being will then be reflected in the mental plane.
You'll be able to express your ideas or theologies in a better way with tawfiq and tasdid ilahi. Dr. Here, I think I recall from your article about Mيرسيا إلياد that he talked about the concept of history, because the religious phenomena is irreducible. So the history of religions is different from any other kind of history, which is also, I think, called in the doctrine of Sayyid Hussein Nasr or other Urafa, sacred history. So this is also the same idea of Ayyamullah, or you're referring to something special here in sacred history?
Yeah. I mean, it's so Eliade, you can't reduce religion and religious phenomena to psychology, to political, social, economic forces, or things like that. What Sayyid Hussein Nasr is talking about with sacred history is that it's a history as a, like you said, kind of Ayyamullah, manifestation of different divine archetypes, names, and qualities. So for example, the Sirah Nabawiyya, the Sirah of the Prophet, the story of the Prophet. Yes, there's the history there, but it's a kind of sacred history, because it's not only the history of the revelation of the Quran and the establishment of Islam, but in a certain sense, it's the story of every soul. It's the story of spiritual development. You have the period before prophecy. You have the Prophet's retreat to Hira. You have the revelation. And all of these you'll see in the various lives of Sufis. They'll compare various stages that they've gone through in their life to stages in the life of the Prophet. Or you have the story of Sayyidina Yusuf in the Quran, Ahsan al-Qasas, which again is not just the story of a particular person in a particular place, but it's the story of humankind, the story of the soul. Or the story of the Bani Israel and Sayyidina Musa being led out of Egypt. It's also the story of the soul leaving the bondage of the ego and wandering through the deserts of Suluk until they reach the promised land. And all this. So this is what's meant by sacred history, it's the manifestation of certain perpetual spirit, exactly, of the spiritual journey. It's the manifestation of the story of a soul, kind of transcendent stories in or as history, but it's much more than just history. That's what he means by sacred history. And Eliade's notion of myth is similar to this, but also a bit distinct. But this is really, when you read particularly the works of the Urafa, but even most of the ulama, this is part of how they read the stories of the Quran as well. It's not just relating a historical narrative.
And you mentioned here, like, recite Quran as if it is
being revealed to you. Yeah, exactly. So don't just read it as this is what someone said to somebody, that this is meant for you right now. And that opens up so much more. And this is one of the interesting things that
language, you also refer to language and art as manifestations of the sacred understanding. Maybe starting with art, you say that the beauty of God, the fitra, the ilm al-huduri, all these stuff, there's a great connection between spirituality, which is manifested in the Islamic art. So if you give a summary about the idea that you mean here.
Yeah, I mean, so, you know, in Allah Jamal wa yuhibbul Jamil wa yuhibbul Jamal. God is beautiful and He loves beauty. And anywhere there's one of the things you can do with the names of God is just plug them into the Shahada. So you can have La Jamil illallah. There's no beauty but God. Any beauty that exists in the world is a manifestation, a reflection, a refraction of divine beauty. And so beauty, whether conceived of as Jamal or Ihsan, is essential to Islamic spirituality and always has been. First and foremost, beauty of character. But the Prophet even said that, those who don't beautify the Quran with the recitation are not amongst us. The formal beauty of it. And this has to do with God's name, Al-Zahir. Certain sages have said it's easier to understand God as Al-Batin than it is as Al-Zahir. Because again, going back to this, Al-Zahir is God. Al-Batin is kind of that which is hidden, which is inward. And Al-Zahir is, in a certain sense, that which transcends the transcendence. So it's manifest outwardly. So the innermost aspects of the Islamic tradition, you could say of the Irfani tradition, are manifest very clearly in the most outward of things in the arts. So if you want to, this is why you have people who don't even understand Arabic, they'll cry when they hear the Quran, when they hear beautiful verses, or the Adhan. I can't tell you how many people I know, young and old, either converted or had, if they didn't convert, had a kind of spiritual experience when hearing the Adhan, or going into mosques. Beautiful mosque architecture.
Morris mentioned that the first insight with Islam for him was the Adhan and the
Adhan. Yes, so exactly. So many people, this is their key into. I mean, afterwards they might talk about arguments and things like that, but oftentimes it's the beauty. Even in the early in the Sirah, a lot of the early Sahaba, they heard the Quran and they were moved. The beauty of the words, the power of the revelation. There's even stories of people passing out. It was so beautiful they couldn't take it. They passed out. But this beauty is a really essential aspect of.
Even in the ayat, إذا تأملنا, the mushrikun أرادوا أن يذموا النبي when they said he was a sha'ir or he was a
exactly a kahin.
There's another dimension, a haq dimension, that actually the sihr ilahi. Or
yeah. No, I mean that's why they call poetry sihrun halal. It's illicit magic. Because the beauty of language performs a function almost that's magical.
As examples, how can we see this sacred art manifested, for example, in some of the paintings or in poetry, for example, especially in Sufi poetry? It has a very mystical mystery in its language.
Exactly. No, I mean Sufi poetry, it's very interesting. The greatest poets of almost every language in which there are a lot of Muslims, among the greatest poets, they're always Sufi poets. And so in Persian, Hafiz, Rumi, etc. In Arabic, you have Ibn al-Farid. In Turkish, you have Yunus Emre. You have in various Turkic languages, Fuzuli, Ghalib, and others. In Punjabi, Sindhi, Bengali, all of the greatest poets are Sufis, because these authors had access to the realms of divine beauty, and that beauty conformed themselves to it. That beauty imprinted itself on their souls and was then manifest in their verse in a particularly powerful way. And you see this often with as well a lot of the artisan guilds. So that's in the kind of poetic and musical arts, but a lot of the artisan guilds as well that would do like Zalige tiles in Morocco, or that were architects in various places. They're parts of Futua or Sufi orders. The head tradesman would be a sheikh. So textile manufacturers, the Masons Guild in Jenne that build, these big mud mosques. They're basically a kind of, they have an initiatic line and training that combines ethical, basically like Sufi tarbiyah, with their craft and their trade. And they also learn the symbolism, the correspondences between what they're making in this world, in the macrocosm, with things in the microcosm, in the human soul, and then in the metacosm, in the divine reality. And so it basically, it's the science of symbolism.
Symbolism of the dance of the Rumi's
of the Mevlevis, exactly. So that's a great example. So it's a very beautiful dance. It started with Maulana. It started with Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi. In a particular state, he had a particular hal or maqam, which then expressed itself in this dance with all of its symbolism. And then that became codified, and people learned it and passed it down. You have the same thing with some of these features of mosque architecture. Somebody had an inspiration, they did it, they formalized it, and they passed the rules down for people to do. So, I mean, what Islamic art essentially does is it depicts the kind of intermediate world of archetypes, and it makes it sensible and tangible to us, and allows us to it's a bridge between a kind of everyday sensory reality and the spiritual realities, the spiritual divine realities.
Maybe
and that's why
geometry and how they shaped or they built some mosques or places, they meant some, there is dalalat for everything.
Absolutely, I mean, unbelievable. I mean, when they reconstructed the minbar of Salahuddin, they found the proportions between some of the different patterns were identical to the ratios between the sun and the earth, and the sun and Venus, and the sun and Mars, and the all kinds of dalail all over the place. In the numerical symbolism as well too. Most of the ceilings, you'll notice, have some kind of 8 pattern, octagonal or something like that. In the Quran, the arsh is carried by eight angels. 8 also represents the heart, and so it's the intermediary between the throne, heaven, and then the base, which is usually square, the earth. If you look on the minbars, the geometric patterns, they usually have a 6 on them. 6, or they'll have 14. Either way, it represents the Prophet. Taha, if you add up numerical symbolism, is 14. 14 is also the number of the full moon. It's halfway through. It's through the lunar cycle. It's the number of the luminous letters. Sabon Mathani. So many things with 14. 6 as well too. 6 is the perfect number. 1 + 2 + 3. 6 is the letter Waw in the abjad system, and Waw is what joins things together as well. It's also the very last letter in terms of the makharij, the places where the letter comes out. So Waw represents the Prophet Muhammad, who joins things together, and is the very last thing to come in creation, the very purpose of creation, the last of the prophets. And so that letter Waw and that 6, you'll see whether stars of Solomon or hexagonal patterns, you'll see often. And then in the mihrab, you'll also see often a combination of 5 and 6 together. So which is 11, which is the 1 standing before the 1. 5 and 6 in Arabic is Huwa, which, as you know, is in the name of in the abjad system, it's Huwa, which is the name of the divine essence, Ahuya, and all these other. So this is just scratching the surface. The people who constructed and designed and made these monuments like the Taj Mahal or the Umayyad Mosque or any of these great traditional mosques lived in a world in which everything was related to everything else. They had the cosmology that they had, whether it was more influenced by Ibn Sina or Ibn al-Arabi or some combination of the two, was one in which the cosmos was reflected within the human being, and both the cosmos and the human being reflected the divine names and attributes. So when you have this connected cosmos, it's then reflected in the architecture, it's then reflected in the poetry, it's reflected in the music, classical Indian music.
Persian paintings, I think.
Even the Persian miniatures.
Meaning all the contradictories of Fana, al-Baqa, al-Akhirah, al-Dunya, al-Asma al-Jamaliyya, Asma al-Jalaliyya, all the Arfani doctrines, he was explaining them to us in a lecture through a very Persian
miniature.
Painting that he had very spiritual experiences with it. So
exactly. And there's something, because these arts are, they serve as ayat, they serve as signs and symbols. They're not trying to, in a certain sense, tie things down. So oftentimes
They
when we
open
speak
the
in,
meanings. The meaning
exactly,
just flow from that.
exactly, exactly, they open the meanings, and so they're productive of more and more meanings. Just like an ayah of the Quran, you can come to it again and again and again and again and again, and you'll never exhaust it. Um, Whereas, let's say a text on logic or something like that, generally isn't like that. I mean, you could come with some kind of Irfani reading. So Sheikh Ibrahim Yas and Sufis have done this. There's Sufi commentaries on the Ajrumiyya, these texts of grammar. It says the al-fa'il huwa Allah. The doer is God. So they'll kind of give an Irfani comment. But those kind of exceptional cases aside, the arts serve because they deal in ayat, they deal in signs, they deal in symbols. You can express a lot with a little, as opposed to a lot of our prose works, which can often express a little with a lot. You read it, you understand it. Like, nobody's going to go back and read a chemistry textbook 10 times and get something new out of it each time. It's very different with deep poetry like that of Hafez or Ibn Farid, or even Sheikh Ibrahim Yas's poetry is amazing, or a Persian miniature, or a great work of Indian classical music.
Even
Or
I recall that Martin Lings, he wrote about the mystical dimensions of Shakespeare either.
Yes, yeah, actually. So yeah, for various reasons, a lot of these kind of theater plays weren't as big in the Muslim world, except for these shadow plays, which Ibn Arabi wrote a lot about, which are very, very profound. But yeah, Shakespeare has some of the same things that Ibn Arabi wrote about, and other Sufis, Ibn Farid, others wrote about the shadow plays. All the world's a stage, all the men and women merely players. So you present the play to people in order for them to recognize the irreality or the relative reality of their own lives. Just as you're sitting here watching the play, which is real but not real, your life is also real but not real. There's a reality beyond your life. And just as you can see there's a reality beyond the play, you
كل ما
can
في الكون وهم أو خيال أو عكوس
exactly,
to
exactly.
reach to the real وجود.
Exactly. So you can reach to the real. Exactly. So there are all of these things. Shakespeare loves doing plays within plays precisely for this reason. So he'll point out to you. So in the middle of a play, there'll be a play. And that will point out to you the artifice of the play, which then makes you think about, whoa, my own world is also,
A great illusion.
a great illusion. So movies do this a lot as well too. So things like Inception or Memento or so The Matrix or things like this, they also
And
make you
this is a
question
great
aspects.
method teaching Arfan through some of the very deep movies. I think in a course with Professor Morris, and I'm mentioning him too much. I'm talking about certain course he was given. So he every day he was giving us a movie, and then the Arfani doctrine we were studying it from analyzing this movie.
Yeah,
And the movies
yeah,
they contain such ideas.
very much so, very much so. Yeah, I like movies a lot. I mean, movies I think are kind of what poetry was for, maybe our grandparents or great grandparents. Movies are for our generation. So everybody quotes from movies. People use movie scenes to, if you want to explain something to one of your friends, and be like, oh, it's like that movie. Remember when Denzel or The Rock said this or that? Um, so it's a kind of popular art that really influences people a
It's to do
lot.
with imagery, خيال عالم الخيال which is
Khayal,
Arabic.
exactly, exactly.
You
It's
mentioned
very
also
much
about
khayal.
in the Quran, for example, Qamis Yusuf. This is a very deep
Yeah,
imagery about Qamis Yusuf.
yeah. So yeah, well, Qamis Yusuf is, I mean, as Rumi said it, I think best, but it's the arts you can say kind of work like this because they cast Yusuf's shirt over the face of Yaqub, and it restores. He smells the scent of Yusuf, and it restores his sight. It restores. So usually when you put a shirt on someone, you put a shirt over my face, I can't see anymore. But the Qamis Yusuf works in this magical way because it carries the scent of Yusuf, the presence of Yusuf, the presence of the beloved. Instead of veiling sight, it's a veil that reveals rather than conceals. So the arts, we think of visual things as things that are veils to the unseen. Right? If I have my eyes open, I'm looking at this, I'm not focusing on the unseen. But the arts, the khayal, these kinds of things, they're veils that reveal. So the way I put it, I think in one of the papers is if there's an invisible person walking around and you want to see him, you throw a blanket on him, right? Then you'll be able to get an outline of the form, and that's the way these arts can work. Yes, they conceal some things, but they also reveal.
So all these images and imaginaries, they help us to understand also such deep conceptual Irfani ideas.
Exactly. They help us go beyond. They help us. The forms that and symbols that point beyond themselves. They help us. The forms that help us go beyond forms. And then in going beyond forms, help us come back to forms and recognize the real in these various different forms. So I mean, in the beginning, we don't. In the beginning, we don't recognize the real, or we don't realize that we're recognizing the real. We just see all these forms. If we follow the right ones, and God is gracious to us, then we can go beyond the forms to the real, and then we can come back and recognize the real in all of these different forms. We can recognize all of these different forms as tajalliyat, as manifestations of the real, some more direct than others. But some of those forms can help us in the journey there.
Great, Doctor. We talked too much. We started from the Prophet, annihilation in the Prophet, religious pluralism, and Mيرسيا إلياد, and now we're talking about Islamic art, Islamic language, the mysteries of such a language. I don't know where we can conclude or summarize. It's also about being tongueless, like Rumi says, when you say, إني نذرت للرحمن صوما فلن أكلم اليوم إنسيا, that wisdom will come in a heart that doesn't claim many things, then God will teach him, and then he will be able to express ideas in a very beautiful way. Let us end with Rumi. Anything you recall from Rumi, a poem, or even from Hafid? You mentioned something from poetry.
For poetry, I mean, I think I forget the Persian of it, but Rumi said, when it comes to love, the pen split and reason became like an ass, a donkey mired in mud. Love that's explained with the tongue is clear, but tongueless love is even more clear. It's love alone that's explained love and being in love. And that's why he ended so many of his poems with khamush, silence.
Khamushi.
Yeah, khamush, because so much, I mean, that was almost his pen name in the Divan-e Shams. So much of all of this, you can say this, all of the sounds of great Sufi poetry and music emerge from that divine silence and lead us back to that divine silence, which is our origin and end, and that's ultimately what we're all seeking, and which is present with us all the time. We just have to learn to be present with it.
Great, Dr. Olademini Organic, thank you very much for being with us, for sharing all this very interesting knowledge and this very long interview. Thank you very much. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah wa shukran.